She also currently has a video series called Dear Katy, which offers advice on how to live sexual integrity in the midst of a very morally permissive culture. Well, not just ours, but around the world. We're very pleased, and I'm very excited to have her with us. Would you please give her your welcome?
Well, I hope you've imbibed deeply of the Lord of the legalese and the academic presentations, because we're going full activist now. Okay, so hopefully you're okay with that. We're going to do a little bit of a tone change. And I was like, well, I'm going to present to some law students, so I better be rigid. But then it was very freeing to watch Reggie, and I'm like, well, she has videos. I got some videos. So we'll start with a video. Right? That's now starting to fall out of fashion. I don't care if my parents get divorced, right? That's now starting to fall out of fashion because there's enough of us who have lived through it and we're going, that's BS. I didn't want to talk about this for a long time because I love to be loved and I hate to be hated. And it was very, very clear, right, that there is the acceptable camp and then there's the unacceptable camp. And so for the longest time I just thought, I don't want to make waves, I don't want to speak up, I don't want to lose friends. But then people started lying about kids. No, I don't think that I'm well-positioned personality-wise to do this. I don't. I'm not the great debater. I don't feel like I've got the arguments. I can't dish it on Twitter. I'm just seeing hurting people, and there's nobody speaking up for them. And there's so many kids that are so burdened because of the decisions that their parents made. And those can be lifelong wounds. That is not my house. I don't know where they got that, FYI. Think about your own life. Did you have a close, loving relationship with your mom and dad? If you did, awesome, that's how it's supposed to be. But I would ask you, which one of them was optional? Which one could you have done without? Your dad or your mom? And the answer is obviously neither. You needed both of them. You probably still do, even if you're 30 or 40 or 50. Now, if you're one of the other 50% of kids in this country who lost a relationship with their mom or dad, full or partial, I'd ask you, did you love it? Did you love it? Would you recommend it? Would you endorse it? Would you codify it into law? Probably not. You'd probably look back on your life and say, that's probably one of the hardest parts of my life that I've had to go through to date. And some of you would say, yeah, it's hard, I got over it, it's okay, I figured it out. Good, you made it out, that's great. But why would we endorse or incentivize or promote the idea that biology doesn't matter and that moms and dads are interchangeable? And yet that's exactly what we're doing. That's exactly where we're at in law right now when it comes to children's rights. We are moving away from saying that biology is the basis for parenthood, and we're moving towards laws that say that the basis for parenthood is intent. I intend to parent this child. Now that's really problematic because a kid who's growing up in a home with a non-biological adult, especially a non-biological male, statistically, the likelihood of them being neglected or abused skyrockets. And so when we decide to treat kids as commodities, right, when we decide to say that they're just items to be cut and pasted into the home of any adult that has the means to get their hands on them, we're willingly putting kids at risk. And we're breaking their heart. Do I walk away? No. Okay.
Close that tab for the next video.
Oh, good.
Okay. Good. All right, that'll be next. Okay, so I started writing about this. So, like in the Christian world, I think all of us kind of fall somewhere on the spectrum of like grace giver or truth teller, right? And one of those two things come really
pretty easily to most of us. Like the truth tellers one's like, I don't care, I'm just gonna say that. That's the truth, and that's what needs to be out there. And they don't care as much about the relational fallout of that. They're like, the truth matters and it needs to be spoken. And then there's like others that are like, you know, I just want to love everybody. And I don't want to make waves, and I want to just connect and empathize, right? So most of us are somewhere on that spectrum, and I'm like right here, right? I would so much rather just keep the peace than make waves. I like to keep my friends, you know, and I'm willing to not speak up to keep my friends. So that's kind of where I am. But what happened is, in 2012, it was really like immediately after Obama evolved on the subject of gay marriage, right? Where I felt like there was a temperature change in the nation. And right after that, I used to listen to NPR a lot, naively thinking, any minute now, and they'll represent my position, honestly, I'm sure, right? False. But I felt like every media outlet at that point felt free to play the bigot card. Right? Now that we've got the president on our side of the gay marriage issue, we can now demonize everybody who opposes gay marriage as bigots, haters, homophobes, whatever, right? And so, obviously, I objected to that for several reasons. The first is that just like pretty much every conservative Christian and traditional marriage supporter, I know and love lots of people who are gay. Right? So obviously my motivation for supportive traditional marriage did not stem from the idea that I hated gay people or I didn't know any or I'm phobic against them, right? And one of those gay relationships is my mom. So my parents divorced when I was 10. And my dad dated and remarried, but soon after their divorce, my mom fell in love with a woman, and they've been together ever since. And they've always been a part of my life, right? I've always had a very close relationship to both my mom and my dad, thank God. You know, even after the divorce, they had a close, they were genuine friends. And so I still had access to both of my parents. I still got to benefit from the love of my mother, the love of my father, and the distinct and complementary benefits that mothering and fathering gives to children. My mom and her partner could hold a clinic on stability and commitment, right? So none of this opposition to gay marriage comes from a place of going, well, gays aren't capable, right? They don't have the ability to love. They do. They totally do, right? So it's something else. There's something else going on there. And so, but what really pushed me over the edge is what I heard the gay lobby saying is children raised in the home of two men or two women love it. And there's no difference between kids raised in same-sex headed households and kids raised in opposite sex headed households. And I was like, now you're just lying. Now you're lying. Because I've worked with kids for 20 years in youth ministry, kids that have been adopted, and there's really no pain in a child's life like the pain of being rejected by or losing or being separated from your mother or father. Even in situations where children are being raised in the home of a loving heterosexual Christian married couple, right? Those children overwhelmingly still tend to be very curious about their birth parents and often tend to feel like there must be something wrong with me that they didn't want me, right? So much of the time, except in the situation of a death, a parent abandoning them, a loss of a parent due to divorce, relinquishment at the point of adoption, it's such a deep wound that a lot of the times kids start to think, it must be because of me, right? You can talk to a lot of adopted or children of divorce and they'll say, I think that, something inside of me said it must have been my fault, right? Because it's such a primal wound. So I started blogging about this and had a very kind of angry moment, right? Where I'm like, oh, I see how it is. I see, it doesn't matter how much I love my gay family and friends. It doesn't matter how good my research is and my rationale is, right? It doesn't matter what my personal experience is. If I oppose this political conclusion of gay marriage, I'm a bigot, right? And everyone's like, yeah, that's right. And I'm like, okay. Well, how about I just start a blog called Ask the Bigot? And then you can ask me all your questions, right? Because obviously that must be what it is. So strangely, the URL was not taken for the title, Ask the Bigot. So I started blogging at Ask the Bigot, and my point was, I'm going to be the most unbigoted person, right? I want to destroy this narrative of bigotry as being a motivation for opposition to gay marriage. And so my goal was to talk to the Christian community, in one sense, and say, look, Christians, stop compromising. I have a lot of patience for non-Christians who are wrestling through these issues and trying to understand it. I don't have any patience for Christians that get this wrong, honestly. There is enough scripture, right, that says that there is one approved outlet for sexual expression in scripture, and it is between a married man and woman. That model serves children very well, by the way. Right? So my motivation for the Christian community is saying, you need to hold on to biblical truth with all your might. Right here. Hold on to it. Don't let it go. And if you let it go, you're sinning against God. And you need to be the most loving, sacrificial, compassionate, empathetic person in the lives of your gay family and friends, because they're precious and he died for them. And if you don't do this with all your might, you're sinning against God. Now, that's really hard, to do this 100% and this 100%, right? Because like for the grace givers, we're like, yeah, we love this. And the truth tellers are like, that's uncomfortable, right? But for the truth tellers, we're like, we love this, but this is uncomfortable. So that's why we have a Savior who walked in grace and truth, right? Because he will help us, he will make up for the lack of whatever side of that issue that we're missing, right? So that was my message to the Christian community when I was blogging. So my message to the policy question when I was blogging is, this is actually not about adults. And that is the main problem that I have found whenever we talk about questions about marriage, family, parenthood, reproductive technologies. It obsessively focused on the desire of adults, right? Think about all the different things that you've read or situations that you know, right? You can open the New York Times and every month or more, they've got some glamorous piece about the joys of open marriages and non-monogamy and all of that, right? And they don't talk about the kids, right? They talk about what the adults want and how happy it makes the adults feel. Think about like celebrity divorces, right? You don't focus on the kids. You focus on, oh, these adults are suffering so much. It's been so difficult. Boy, can you believe what Jeff Bezos and his wife have been through? They've got a kid. That kid's life just got wrecked, right? Nobody's talking about that. Same thing when, you read a story about somebody who's felt like they were in the closet, they've got 3 kids, right? But then they need to come out to be their true self. And the whole article is framed around, oh my gosh, look at how this person has suffered. And you know what? They probably have. They probably have. But nobody's focusing on the 3 kids who are now going to have to split time between different households, right? And probably have to deal with the revolving door of partners or spouses in the life of their parents. And so my goal of beginning to write about this is saying, look, marriage is a social justice issue for children, right? And that there may be no difference between the love and commitment that I have between my husband and 2 men or 2 women's love and commitment for one another, right? In terms of our emotional connection, there might be no difference. There is a radical difference in what we have to offer children, right? Especially our own children. And that is actually the only reason that government is involved in this at all, right? Government doesn't sit there and hand out marriage licenses so that it can put its stamp of approval on your love life, right? Or my love life. When Congress enacted DOMA in 1993, they said the reason why we're doing this, the Defense of Marriage Act, government has an interest in marriage because it has an interest in children, right? That is the only state interest in marriage at all, right? Okay, so that's what I started kind of spewing about back then. And I started blogging anonymously because I know the other side is crazy, right? I know. And so I was like, I'm not going to use my own name, no big deal, right? I'll let other people do that. But then, there was a gay blogger overseas who decided that I needed to be outed under the name of accountability. And so he back searched some, I don't know how he did it, right? But there was some picture I posted, and from that he got an IP address connected to the church where my husband's a pastor, found out who my husband was, and then outed me. But not only that, published all the names and addresses of our home community leaders, right? As a way to be like, you better shut up. right? Or we're coming to get all your people. And that was terrifying. But I was like, man, this is so, looking back, I'm like, it's so classic what the enemy means for evil kind of thing. Because when I was blogging anonymously, nobody could find me. I couldn't find them. But once I was like out of the closet, people were like, hey, you want to come speak about this? Hey, you want to write this amicus brief? Hey, you want to come speak to congressmen? Right? So he meant to shut down my platform, and he really just enlarged it 100-fold. So what happened after that is I started connecting with other kids who had gay and lesbian parents who feel like they couldn't talk about it, right? Because the world has made this incredibly expensive for kids to share their stories, right? A lot of, I think that on our website, maybe only 25% of the stories of especially kids with same-sex parents have shared with me make it to the website. Most of them are like, I can't write about this, not even under a pseudonym, not even changing the names and places of where I grew up, because if anybody finds out, I'll lose a relationship with everybody that, you know, the rest of my family members. And so, but we started to kind of find each other, and it's the stories that really have the power, right? And, well, I'll talk about that in a second. So we started connecting with other kids, and I remember, like, I would speak, you know, visit Australia or visit Taiwan, and I'm like, why isn't anybody doing this? Like, children actually have universally recognized rights to their mother and father. It is in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, right? Right after your right to not be killed is your right to be connected to the two people who are responsible for your existence, right? In items 7 through 12, and then again in 19, right? And then beyond that, all of these rights to be connected and kinship bonds and extended family and reunification if you're separated. I mean, like, this is a high priority throughout the world. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, correct me if I'm wrong, is the most widely ratified treaty, right? So it's not a new concept that children have a right to their parents. Not just that you have a right to the children that are born to you. There's a lot of good organizations that are working on parental rights, and that's really important. But if you don't do it from the bottom up too, that's where kids become, it's very risky for kids, because then they simply become commodities, right? When you sever a child's connection to their birth parents, right, that's when they're really at risk. So I talked to my conservative friends, and they're like, I don't really get, you know, like, why don't you just deal with like religious liberty issues and like small government and all of that? And I'm like, you actually don't get any of those things. Unless you get on board with this cause, right? Unless you can fight for a child's right to their mother and father, you're not gonna get small government or low taxes. You're never gonna be able to reduce the welfare state, right? Because when mom or dad is absent, the government has to take over. The government does not do it very well, and it costs a lot more money, and it's ineffective. You know why? Because the state cannot love a child. That's why. And then I talked to my liberal friends, and they're like, Katie, if you care about justice, why aren't you working on issues of like child trafficking and reducing homelessness and suicide and high incarceration rates and falling academic rates? And I said, would you do me a favor? Dig down and look at the populations who are most at risk of living in poverty or being incarcerated at, you know, in their lifetime. Tell me what demographic is overrepresented there. It's fatherless kids, right? So when you are denied your right, when a child loses the ability to be known and loved and raised by both their mother and father, I'm not saying that it's an ironclad, trouble-free life, because it's not. But you stack the deck against kids when they are being raised outside of a loving relationship with both their mother and father. So, you know, I love that this conference is focused on the most vulnerable. Christians have a special obligation to protect the most vulnerable. The fatherless is mentioned over and over and over, the orphan and the fatherless, all throughout Scripture. And because fatherlessness has been with us forever, but because of this new frontier of changing laws and new technology, we're actually now looking at the first ever wave of intentional motherlessness as well, right? So the risks to children are dire. So I was like, well, why isn't anybody doing this, right? And it was so classic, just like what Professor Stanton was saying, right? You look around and you're like, how come nobody's doing this yet? So somebody better get here soon. Start defending the rights of kids. Somebody's got to show up. Maybe I should do that, right? So that's what we did. Is me, along with several other children who experienced parental loss, either through abandonment, divorce, donor conception, or kids with same-sex parents. We started an organization called Them Before Us. Them, the children, before us, the adults, right? The rights of children before the desires of adults. It is the only organization solely devoted to defending children's rights in family structure. There are lots of incredible pro-family organizations that are doing good work, but I think that a lot of times they can also kind of fall into the trap of focusing on adults and what adults want and centering their arguments around adults. This movement, this global children's rights movement that we are starting, does not pit gays against straights or Christians against atheists. You know, we have gays and lesbians at every level of our leadership. Some of the most noble children's rights activists are gays and lesbians because they have a lot at stake. They are ostracized, you know, for speaking up, and so their voices are particularly valuable. We have Mormons and Catholics. We have got one very mouthy Baptist pastor's wife on staff. We've got atheists because I just think it's so fascinating that in this world of identity politics, right, where we're being broken up by race and class and language and nation of origin and all of that, there's not a lot that we have in common anymore. But there's one thing we have in common, and that is that all of us came from a man and woman. And we either understand how precious and important it was to be loved and known by that man and woman, or how painful it was to lose a relationship with that man and woman. So, you know, why I don't talk a whole lot about this doing public policy, because I don't think that it's effective or appropriate to use scripture when talking about public policy, right? That's not the world's authority. So the world's authority is natural law. So that's where we have to argue from. But in the Christian context, you know, why is it that God identifies the fatherless as a population that deserves special recognition and protection? Well, it's because in biblical times, what would happen when a child was fatherless is they had limited access to commodities, right? They were much more likely to live in poverty. It increased their chances of being victimized and sold into slavery. Right? It decreased their chances of receiving justice in the courts. It made them easy targets for exploitation and oppression. What happens today when children are fatherless? Exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. Right? 90% of homeless and runaway youth are fatherless, and I work with some organizations that seek to intervene in children who have been trafficked. Most of those children are trafficked after running away or becoming homeless. 70 to 85% of prison inmates grew up without a father. You know, I read an article that said prisons are pretty much holding tanks for fatherless boys. That's what prisons are. 63% of teenagers who commit suicide have absent fathers. Fatherless children are 4 times more likely to live in poverty. 71% of pregnant teenagers come from fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. You'll be hard-pressed to find a mass shooter who had a loving relationship with his father. There's really no social issue. You will not have any social justice in this country until you secure justice for the individual child. Many sociologists have posited that fatherlessness is the greatest crisis facing America today because it feeds every other crisis that we're facing today. In the 1960s, there was only 5% of kids who were born to unmarried mothers. Today, it's 41%. For Black youth, it's 71%. And those Black kids who do have a married mother and father, by the time they reach high school, only 17% of them will have only lived with their married mother and father. So we are starving children. We are starving them for what they are made for. Like when I talk with youth, I say there's 3 staples of a child's social emotional diet: mom's love, dad's love, and stability. Right? It's good to have other things too, but if you're missing out on one of those 3 macronutrients, you're going to be malnourished socially. It's not to say that you're doomed. It is to say that there are very distinct challenges that you're going to have to overcome as a result. So, lessons that I learned from the marriage battle. So arguing online is a great tutor. It's a great way to figure out, like, what are we getting wrong here? Why is my argument not getting through? Right, so I learned a lot while I was arguing online about the marriage battle. And so here's 3 key lessons that I took away from that, that kind of the arrows of our side. And the first one is, we did not highlight the true victims. We didn't really highlight who was going to be harmed the most if we redefined marriage. Now the other side said the victims are adults, right? The victims are the gay and lesbian adults who deserve to be married. And on our side, the victims, right? I don't know, did somebody was there some kind of like national consensus among conservative groups of deciding that it was going to be religious Americans who were going to be painted as the victims if gay marriage ultimately passed? Because that's what I heard. And that was really bad messaging. And I totally understand that we are at threat. Religious Americans are under pressure. And I listened to the speakers from last year who were fabulous, right? From ADF talking about the cake maker and the picture taker and the candlestick maker and all of that, right? Like that's true, and religious liberty is under threat. But that is not the real victim of the redefinition of marriage. The victims are children, period. And misidentifying the victims means that you get the policy wrong, right? If you don't get the victims right, you're not going to get the policy right. And so because gay adults were framed as the victims on this side and religious Americans were framed as the victims on this side, nobody was focusing on the real victims, which was kids. So we'll talk more about that, right? About how, well, we'll talk about it now. That when you redefine marriage, you redefine parenthood. Marriage and parenthood laws are so closely related to one another that you can't make husband and wife optional without also making mother and father optional in law. And as I look at different countries that have legalized gay marriage around the world, as far as I can tell, none of them have done that while simultaneously strengthening children's rights. Wherever gay marriage goes, the rights of children are weakened because you have to, right? In this country, there's no longer any political institution that recognizes that children should have a mother and father. To even say that constitutes discrimination, okay? The next thing I learned is that story is key. And you know, I had good arguments, good rationale, the best research, great statistics, right? We have the 5 major religions of the world on our side when it comes to traditional marriage. I think it's fascinating that Buddhists, Hindus, Jews, Muslims, and Christians disagree about the nature of God, the nature of man, the problem with the world, the solution to the problem, and the afterlife. And yet all 5 of them have something that resembles man-woman marriage, right? That's a consensus if I've ever heard one. But it doesn't matter because the other side told better stories. The other side humanized their argument. And it's, you know, in this culture, it's being moved that wins our hearts more than statistics do. Now, admittedly, it's really hard to get the stories of kids who have grown up with 2 moms or 2 dads, and who are old enough to talk about it, and who are willing to take the political heat for talking about it, right? So that's why those stories are so hard to find. But if you can find them, that's what's really going to change the national debate. So we just did this video. I got a request from a pro-family organization connected with ADF in the Czech Republic saying, we are debating gay marriage, and I was wondering if you might be able to send a video or do a presentation for our members of parliament that we can share at this conference and then also put on our Facebook page, and because we want to hear the story. And so we scrapped our weekend plans, like filmed this over Skype, sent it to them. I mean, it's really hard to do this within a couple, we had like 4 or 5 days to do it. And when you're asleep and they're awake, and then they're awake and you're asleep, it's hard to coordinate. But we were able to pull it off. They shared this, I think, 48 hours ago on their Facebook page, and it already has 1.2 thousand shares. In a country of 10 million, that's pretty good, right? So this is the video that we produced for the Czech Republic. And tell me, like, think about it. How different would the debate have gone here in this country if this had been what we were doing instead of talking about statistics, studies, or that the worst thing that would happen if gay marriage was legalized is somebody would have to bake a cake they didn't want to bake?
My name is Brady Walton, and I am speaking to you today on behalf of Them Before Us, the only organization solely devoted to defending children's rights and family. I was invited by Alliance Pro Rodinu, and I'm honored to speak to you, the conference in the House of Commons in the Czech Republic. I want to talk to you about the population who is most at risk when we redefine marriage: children. Marriage and parenthood go hand in hand, and when we redefine marriage, we redefine parenthood as well. Mothers and fathers will become optional in law if gay marriage is legalized. The problem is, from the child's perspective, mothers and fathers are never optional.
That says, how did it feel growing up with 2 moms and no father?
My mother and my father divorced when I was a year old. After their divorce, my mother did not allow my father to see me again. Somewhere around the age of 4, my mother began dating women. I remember feeling that something wasn't right. And whenever I got to start going over to friends' houses and staying the night, friends who had a mom and a dad and they lived with them, I began to understand what was different about the way that I was being raised. I was jealous of my friends. I was jealous of them having a father that spent time with them, that they got to hug and love on and be cherished by. I wondered what it would be like to be hugged by a man, to be held by him, to be comforted by him. I wondered what men smelled like and just what their personalities were like and what it would be like to live with one constantly. About the age of 7 was when I really began to understand that my mother was a lesbian. And I remember being completely devastated when it connected in my brain what she was, because it meant that I was never going to have a father, that I was never going to live with a man before I left her home. And it was devastating and it was sad to me. And the fact that my mother would not allow me to see my father, she wouldn't allow me to have pictures of him, to speak with him, with my grandparents, whom I got to have contact with. They were not allowed to talk about him with me. So it was this person that almost didn't exist because she had completely erased him. And it was excruciating. I spent hours as a child fantasizing about what he looked like, what his voice sounded like, the places that he would take me, and the things that we would do. At some point, I began waving at every airplane that flew over my house because I thought, what if he's in the airplane? And what if he sees me? I wanted him to know that even though he wasn't there, I still loved him. Unfortunately for me, the fantasy of what it would be like to meet my father did not come true. Whenever I met him, whenever I was 16, it was as though too much time had passed and we never really clicked with one another, and we were never capable of developing a true father-daughter relationship. And at 37 years old, I still feel robbed of that opportunity. It's not fair that it was something that I didn't get to have. Two mothers never made up for the absence of my father. Having love, and I did have love, from two women could not make up for not having his love.
So, how different do you think the discussion would have gone, right, if that was our focus, right? But that wasn't. And I think that that's a reason, one major reason why we were ineffective in our advocacy for traditional marriage. So the third thing that I learned when arguing online is that hypocrisy killed us. There were some of us who were saying, look, marriage is, regardless of what's going on with the adults, right? Marriage exists for children. And that is the public's interest in marriage. And children have a right to be known and loved by their mother and father. So that's why this is so important. And they're like, yeah? Is that why you're making a really big deal about no-fault divorce? And you're like, Oh, is that why you oppose nice Christian heterosexual couples using sperm donors to have kids? And you're starting campaigns about that, right? And they were right. They were right. You know, that those that did want to rightly speak up about children and how they were going to be impacted if marriage is redefined, that passion was absent. You know, when you're talking about heterosexuals who are willfully violating children's rights to their mother and father. So we have tried to take all of these lessons and put them to good use. So we've developed a brand, Them Before Us, that seeks to use story to highlight the true victims and critique all practices and ideas and policies that prioritize adult desires over children's rights. And I'll say, you know, we support any adult, gay or same-sex attracted or straight, who is defending the rights of children and protecting their rights. And we will oppose any adult, gay or straight, who is asking kids to sacrifice so that they can live as they please. My husband and I were on a walk a couple weeks ago, and you know, I was talking about different things that were going on, and he goes, Katy, like, what do you want? Like, if you could measure success, what does success for Them Before Us look like? And I was like, a global takeover. Right, that's it. We will succeed when I want world domination, right? That's what I'm after. That anytime there's a conversation about marriage, parenthood, child rearing, fertility, anything like that, right? Somebody is always there going, wait a second, what about the kids? Right? I understand that you're suffering and infertility is so hard, so hard. I understand that your marriage is really hard right now and you guys are having communication and intimacy issues and it's really difficult. What about the kids? Right? I understand that you're 37 and you haven't met the right guy and you just feel like your biological clock is ticking and you know you could put in $2,000 and get, you know, find a donor and have what about the kids? Right? Or anytime that you're discussing this in policy, definition of marriage, whether or not to legalize commercial surrogacy, what about the kids? Right? That question is asked first and every other comment revolves around the rights of children. Right? That's success. Okay. So the marriage battle, I start out talking about this because that's how I got into it. A lot of us are a little more familiar with that issue. But the definition of marriage was not the beginning of the threat to children, and it is certainly not going to be the end, right? And that there are so many different issues that are impacting the rights and well-being of children today, and they all stem from the same problem, right? They're all really symptoms of the same issue, and that is a disregard for the rights of children. And we're looking at polygamy and divorce and 2 women on birth certificates and all of these different issues about family, and they're not separate issues. And I don't think that we should respond with religious arguments, and we certainly should not respond by pearl clutching or anything like that, right? That the effective response is going to be the response that is child-centric to all of these questions, right? So we'll go through a couple of them. The definition of marriage. What is the child-centric definition of marriage? It is simply that heterosexual marriage is the only relationship that brings together the 2 people to whom children have a natural right. Therefore, it deserves special recognition and protection. So, what about polygamy, polyamory? Well, anytime you've got a non-biological adult in the home with the child, especially an unrelated man, risks to children for abuse, neglect, skyrocket, right? That is not a child-friendly practice. What about no-fault divorce? And I want to make a quick distinction here. There are times where it is important for there to be a separation, and we support at-fault divorce when one adult is found to be at fault in that relationship because of abuse or addiction, adultery. And the good thing about at-fault divorce is it allows the court to side with the innocent spouse. Now, with unilateral no-fault divorce, the judge will treat both parties equally, even though one of them has been more faithful to the child and to the covenant relationship than the other one does, right? No-fault divorce lowers the standard of adult behavior throughout marriages, whereas at-fault divorce raises the standard of behavior. No-fault divorce, children will lose a daily relationship with both of their parents. One study showed that 42% of kids after 2 years lose a relationship with their father altogether after divorce. Single motherhood by choice, regardless of how much the child is wanted, it is unjust to intentionally deny children a relationship with their father. Adult-centric adoption. This is a big one. Gays do not have a right to adopt. Heterosexuals do not have a right to adopt either. Nobody has a right to adopt. Children who have lost their parents have a right to be adopted. And that child placement always has to be child-centric. Adoption is not a means for adults to get kids. It is a just society's response to children who have lost their parents. Same-sex marriage. When you redefine marriage, you redefine parenthood, right? And you make mothers and fathers optional in law. What about cohabitation, right? Marriage rates are declining. Cohabitation is on the rise. Childbearing remains fairly steady. That means more children are being raised in cohabiting relationships. Cohabitation is not a child-friendly place to be. Children are 4 times more likely to be neglected or abused, even if they are raised in the home of both of their biological unmarried parents. So something about the marriage relationship, even among both biological parents, provides a level of protection for children. What about sperm and egg donation? Okay, this is probably one of the areas where we comment the most because it is a wild west. You know, reproductive technologies in the United States is a wild west, and there's a lot of times zero regulation about it at all. But these children who are conceived through sperm and egg donation, right now the crop of adults who are able to talk about this are sperm conceived children from the 60s and 70s and 80s. Those children were largely raised in married heterosexual homes with a social father. Okay, so now those are the kids that are speaking up about the genealogical bewilderment that they experienced, or the tenuous relationship they had with their social parent, where they never, even if they did not know that they were donor conceived, they felt like there's just something, why am I not connecting? Why do they not treat me the same way as the other kids, right? And then they take a DNA test, 23andMe or something like that, and realize that nose that I got from my dad, not my dad's, right? And I always knew there was something going on, is how a lot of them feel. It does not matter the family formation of the intended parents, right? Heterosexual couples, single mother by choice, single father by choice is now happening, same-sex parents, it does not matter. Using donor egg and donor sperm means intentionally creating a mother or fatherless child, and it's an injustice. The promotion of same-sex parenthood, which is glamorized there's lots of organizations devoted to promoting same-sex parenthood. But whenever you look at those pictures, right, which look great, by the way, gay men know how to dress their kids. and they make really cute family photos. Every time you look at that, though, you need to say, there is somebody that child has a natural right to who couldn't exist that is not pictured, right? For those two men or that single man or those two women, right, to create a child, they have to cut out. Somebody is not pictured that the child probably really would like to have a relationship with. Two moms on birth certificates, right, that now state by state is changing birth certificate laws and saying that using this presumption of paternity, which has historically said, you know, the man who's married to the woman who gives birth, we presume that to be the father. Because almost 100% of the time that's true, right? So same-sex couples have said, well, you need to treat us exactly the same, right? So if I gave birth to this child, that means that my wife should be presumed to be the parent of the child. And so what it does is it uses the presumption of paternity exactly in reverse. The presumption of paternity used to unite the child with both biological parents on their birth certificate almost 100% of the time. Applying it to same-sex couples means that will never be the case 100% of the time, right? So that's the problem with equating two things that for children are not equal. If you want to talk about children's rights, children have a right to an unadulterated birth certificate that records the actual facts of their birth. And that is also outlined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the birth certificate exists to serve the child. It is not an instrument of adult intent. It's not a second marriage license, right? And finally, surrogacy. Whether or not the child is genetically related to the intended parents, which they often are, in heterosexual couples especially, on the day of birth, the surrogate is the only parent the child knows. The two intended parents who are standing in the hospital room, they might be genetically related to the child, but neither of those two people are the one that is going to provide that child with the comfort, the milk, the smell, the voice that they know and long for, right? As I've been trying to get this movement started, there is one demographic that has not joyously gotten on board with my mission. And it's not the donor-conceived kids, and it's not the kids of divorce, and it's not the children with same-sex parents, it's adoptees. So and if you go to our Facebook page, you'll see it every now and then, that there are adoptees groups that fight us tooth and nail because I support adoption when it's properly understood. But they will say, do you understand how harmed we were by being separated from our birth mother on the day that we were born? That resulted in a primal wound, and they are right. Losing your birth mother, losing your mother at birth is traumatic for children. And so adoptees will say, that was so traumatic for me. How can you endorse that at all? How can you see adoption as anything that's good at all? They can't conceive of a scenario where things would be so bad with birth mother, or that the birth mother would not be in such a good place, that it would justify the pain that they've experienced as a result of losing her on their first day of life on this side of the womb. And so that maternal separation at birth is very, very serious. And surrogacy intentionally inflicts that wound on children. So you may have noticed there's a bit of a common theme in all of these different issues that I've just talked about. A couple of common things. Number one, you're probably going, you're going to piss off a lot of people. And the answer is you're right. Like, give me enough time and I will run afoul every adult group in the United States, because there's not a lot of people who are orienting their lives around the rights and needs of their own children or other children. The other thing is that you've noticed that what is the one common thread here? And it is the expectations that adults do the hard thing so that children don't have to sacrifice their fundamental rights. To be child-centric and understand why children deserve special protection makes demands on all of us. And that is that everybody has to conform. Everybody has to discipline themselves. Everybody has to give up. At some point, most of us are probably not going to get everything that we want as it relates to marriage, family, parenthood, whatever. And that's hard. But it is unjust for an adult to say, I don't want to do the hard thing, I'll make the kid do the hard thing instead. So I want to talk about adoption, because especially in Christian groups, you know, that's a dominant theme in our life. I think that in my world, the evangelical world, where I'm up to here in the evangelical world, I think that we've done a really good job of talking about orphan care and talking about defending the rights of the orphan, and many of my friends have adopted. You know, half of our elder board have adopted. I have friends that are like remodeling their homes so they can be foster parents. I mean, we've done a good job of talking about adoption. And so a lot of people will say, okay, well, if you are against donor conception, you must also be against adoption, right? If you're for children's rights to their biological parent, that must mean that you are against adoption. And the answer is, of course not, you silly. Have a seat and we'll talk. So adoption is a just society's response to children in need, right? Adoption functions as an institution that meets the needs of children. And I want to contrast that with reproductive technologies which function as a market to meet the desires of adults. And I want to talk this through and kind of enumerate the differences by talking about what I think is one of the greatest legal threats to children's rights today, and that is the Uniform Parentage Act. So the Uniform Parentage Act, I think, has been around for a while, and the newest kind of iteration of it is a gender-neutral form of the Uniform Parentage Act, because when it was passed in Washington State last year, the sponsor of the bill said, what are you going to do? Gay marriage is legal. I mean, it's unconstitutional to even list the words mother and father in parenthood laws. And he's right. And he's right. You know, we missed the boat so bad on gay marriage because we were so focused on adults. And so he's right, right? So now we in Washington State have the Uniform Parentage Act, which did several things. It legalized commercial surrogacy, and it didn't even say that the surrogate needed to live in Washington State or be a US citizen. You could have a surrogate in Mexico who touches ground in Washington one time for some kind of consultation, then all the rest of the services happen in Mexico, right? It doesn't require that any of the intended parents be US citizens. It's intent-based parenthood, right? So the intended parents don't need to have any kind of genetic connection to the child at all. It scrubbed the law of all references to gender. So there's no expectation that children should or ought to be raised by a man and a woman. It did away with any kind of expectation that there would be only two or must be two parents. So you could have 1, 2, 4. It's not really specified. Adults who could become parents. So if you have the means to assemble egg and sperm and womb, you can walk out of the hospital in Illinois or India, because the baby doesn't have to be born in Washington State, with a legal surrogacy contract, legal parenthood contract, backed by the forces of Washington State. So I testified against this bill, And I did so by contrasting the Uniform Parentage Act with the best practices of adoption. Because back when I was pre-baby, pre my own babies, I worked at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world. One of the things I was responsible for as the assistant director was to ensure that we were in compliance with the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoptions, which was instituted to prevent things like baby selling and trafficking. And there was a lot of very specific provisions in there to ensure that this desire for children did not bleed over into baby selling. There's also been best practices within the adoption world domestically that have evolved because social workers are very focused on the best interest of the child. The Uniform Parentage Act and intent-based parenthood laws defy all of that. So, number one, in adoption, the right to the child's best interest is a primary consideration. In adoption, agencies are constantly thinking, what is the best thing for this kid? When I worked at my adoption agency, our founder and director would say, we're not here to find a child for every couple. We're here to find parents for every child, right? The child is our client, not the adults. The adults might be paying the fees, the kid's our client. The fertility industry exists to provide a baby to any adult, regardless of the cost. Right? Their client is the adult. And that means, in the adoption world, not every adult that wants a kid is going to get one. In the fertility world, you can have a baby if you've got the money, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not you're fit to be a parent. Number two, the right to not be separated from your birth parents against your will. There are so many processes, either internationally or domestically, to ensure that you are not just snatching a kid from their parents, right? You have to go through processes for parental relinquishment, and there's courts involved. And in the international world, you have to do some investigation to make sure that this child has not been trafficked. And those provisions are there because social workers have recognized that we are about to inflict harm by separating this child from their birth parents. We better make sure that they actually are a child in need. Adoption is a last resort, right? Especially now in the foster care system. I'd say sometimes we lean too far and say trying to keep the child with the birth parents, even if it's an unhealthy situation. But social workers have recognized whenever possible, we want to keep this child with its family of origin. In contrast, in the reproductive world, that loss of biological parents is intentional, right? And casual. People think it's no big deal. Number three, the right to safe placements. So social workers are licensed and approved because for the purpose of ensuring that the adoptive parents are screened and vetted, references, background checks, supervision, post-placement reports. My husband and I, our youngest son is adopted, right? And we went through all of that. Physical exams, financial statements. They came to our house, they checked it out, they scrutinized us. Do you know why? Because it's risky to give a kid to an unrelated adult. And it's a violation of the best practices. Can you imagine a social worker, like, oh, you want a kid? Here, take this one. Oh, we don't need to come to your house or look into you. No big deal. They would lose their license, right? Rightly so. The UPA, the Uniform Parentage Act, intent-based parenthood laws, I have yet to see one that has any kind of provision or scrutiny for parents who are walking out of the hospital with the child completely unrelated to them, right? So they can be unrelated to a child and leave, right? Really? I've talked that long? Fascinating. Granting adults parental rights simply based on intent is incredibly dangerous. And that is what turns children into commodities, right? Saying that I intend to parent this child, therefore I have a right to them. Well, now you're just talking about like buying a fancy purse or a car, right? Really, it's the same thing. The right to be born free and not bought and sold. In the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption, it prohibited payments directly to the birth mother or her family because they're like, that's baby selling. Intent-based parenthood laws, especially when it's coupled with commercial surrogacy, you can pay a woman for her child. A lot of times, even if it's her genetic child, you just have to make sure that you sign the contract before conception and not after conception. Before conception, it's a valid surrogacy contract and you're helping somebody become parents. After conception, you're baby selling and you go to jail. Of course, for the kid, the timing of the contract doesn't matter. And finally, the right to preserved kinship bonds. So the adoption world, if you know people who are adopted or have been adopted recently, most of the time it's open adoptions, right? The adoption world is moving towards open adoptions because they recognize kids benefit from as many connections with their family of origin as possible. The fertility industry favors anonymous donors, right? Where they're intentionally denied a relationship and they think it's not important, right? Kid doesn't care. I mean, sure, adoptees tend to care and it helps them, but it doesn't help donor-conceived kids, not a big deal, right? So, in summary, you know, what I say when people say, well, why are you for adoption and against donor conception and surrogacy? The answer is because a just society cares for orphans. It doesn't create them. And that's what we're doing with a lot of these laws. So I could go on and talk about why surrogacy is not a pro-life issue, but I will leave that for your reading later. I wrote an article that I titled, Dear Ben Shapiro, both abortion and surrogacy commodifies children. But when I submitted it to the Federalist, the title they gave it was, Why Ben Shapiro is Dead Wrong About Surrogacy. So if you go to the Federalist and you search my name, that's where you'll find, you know, kind of my expose on why you cannot be pro-life and pro-surrogacy, right? In summary, people think, oh, surrogacy, it's about babies. No. Surrogacy is about designer, on-demand babies shipped worldwide. That's what surrogacy is. Okay, so I will stop there, and we can do questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Questions, please.
Yeah.
Considering that you feel that the fertility industry favors confidentiality,
Mm-hmm.
do you feel that the emerging trend for all of this DNA finding will have an effect on that?
Yes. So there was big news like a month and a half ago was a woman was being sued by her sperm donor clinic because she did a DNA test on behalf of her daughter and found the family of her donor, which is happening with a lot of donor-conceived kids. The sperm bank sent her a cease and desist and said, we are confiscating all of the remaining vials that you've created, the sperm that you've bought that you intended to use for biological siblings, you can't have them because you violated the contract of anonymity. And so now we have competing rights. We have a child's right to be known by their mother and father competing against the donor's expectation of anonymity and privacy, right? And so we're headed for some kind of collision there. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a question, and this is really
Let's just go with praise.
thought-provoking subject, to say the least. But I'm just thinking how to legislate this to have it stand up to constitutional scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, you know, it's not going to, nobody has a fundamental, do we have a fundamental right to have a kid?
You have a fundamental right to have your own kid, but you don't have a right to somebody else's child.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
So then you've got to go with the rational, not somewhere probably an intermediate test sort of situation. And so I guess for me to support either approving legislation that fits your recommendations or something of that, I would have to have some studies, really well put together studies, empirical things that demonstrate that kids that come from folks who design your own babies kind of situation. I don't think she's a good model, frankly. I think what we need is a study where gay parents actually get married the old-fashioned heterosexual traditional way, for lack of better terms, and then want to have a kid. What are happening to those kids? Are they having financial problems, criminal problems, drug problems, and is it because of this homosexual relationship? And are there any studies of this kind of stuff?
Yeah.
This is all new. This whole gay marriage stuff is like 3, 4, 5, I don't know how long it's been on the books, but it hasn't been on
Right.
the books long at all.
So we don't have a whole lot of time to cover this because we could have a whole conversation about this. A couple posts, a couple articles on our website. One is called Study the Studies. And it's all about the studies and what we know statistically about children raised in same-sex homes to this point, right? And I actually have a link in that to something that describes every study that's ever been done and a summary of the findings, okay? Now, there's like 74 of them or something that claim to show no difference. My incredible board member, Mark Regneris, would say that all of those have are methodologically flawed, right? A lot of them are recruited samples of 20 upper class white lesbian couples who are answering on behalf of their kids of how they think their kids are doing. So it will be a long time before we are able to find children raised by same-sex parents who were with their same-sex parents from birth because they were part of this pure sample of children created through sperm or egg donation, find those kids at random, sample them as adults so that they can talk about what actually happened in their life, not the perception that their parents had, right? I mean, it is very hard to get that gold standard of scientific method for a population this small. What I can say is when we're not talking about same-sex parenting, sociologists tend to agree on 4 things. Number 1, men and women offer distinct and complementary benefits to children, right? That they're so distinct that a lot of experts would say there's no such thing as parenting. There's mothering and there's fathering, right? Women don't father, men don't mother, kids need both. Number 2, children who lose a relationship with their biological parent through death, divorce, abandonment, even if they're subsequently adopted, or donor conception, do not fare as well. Outcomes for these groups are incredibly diminished, right? Number 3, children suffer trauma, right, when they lose a relationship with one or both of their parents. We actually have studies that say that children who have experienced father loss due to abandonment, death, or incarceration have shorter telomeres, right? The end caps of their chromosomes are smaller because they lost a relationship with their father. And the final thing that we know is that non-biological adults are not as connected to, protective of, and invested in children. And that is another reason why we have high standards for adoptive parents. Now, when we're not talking about same-sex parents, sociologists agree on all of those things. So isn't it strange that all 4 of those factors are at work in same-sex headed households, and we have these studies that say that there's no difference? It's probably because the methodology behind those studies was flawed, and that's exactly right. So in Study the Studies on our website, we've got links to the studies that have been done that have used random populations and that surveyed large government data to come to their conclusion, as opposed to going to the local LGBT bookstore and looking for people who wanted to do a parenting survey. Yeah.
Do you have any studies on children of divorced parents who did have access to both parents equally through joint custody, like Clapworth, let's say?
Yes. So you can definitely do divorce better. Some divorces are better than others, right? But no divorce is going to improve outcomes statistically for kids. Divorce is an ACE, an adverse childhood experience, right? And it's an ACE that often leads to other ACEs. And so we have this kind of misnomer that divorce is a one-time thing, or the kids are resilient and they'll get over it. When you actually look at children of divorce, what divorce is it's the very first loss that leads to lots of other losses and transitions. It is the beginning of instability. It is the beginning of transition, a lifetime of transition and loss for kids, where dad moves out, mom gets a husband, dad gets a wife, she's got some kids, these guys divorce, he moves to this place, she gets another job. I mean, you look at the children of divorce that you know, and their lives are characterized probably by instability. So even good divorces are going to starve kids of one of those critical social emotional factors of their diet. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm a divorced child.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here with my stepdad.
Yeah.
I have a happy, balanced life.
Great.
I don't know where you're getting your percentage study from.
Thank you so much for speaking up about that. There are absolutely heroic stepfathers and mothers out there. Heroic, right? And so that's why as an organization we say we are for adults who are doing hard things, right? We support the adults who are doing the hard things in the life of kids. And a lot of times that means being a foster parent and being an adoptive parent and being a step parent who steps in to fill that void for kids. But statistically, outcomes for kids do not improve when stepdad joins the family, right? That the lone mother, studies show that lone mothers, that it tends to be equal when stepdad joins the family. Now those are statistical outcomes, right? And there are times where you've got the man or the woman that steps in to fill that void. Yeah.
I have a question, Katie, just piggybacking off the question that the gentleman here just had. So knowing that you don't have all the statistics from same-sex marriages raising a child, because it is a new subject. So I find it very, surprising that you're very confident that therefore this is, not going to be successful when we still don't even have the number to measure that success. But I guess thinking forward, if that success ever comes back as either being equal to being raised same traditional marriage or even more successful than traditional, what is your platform going to be?
Yeah, well then that would blow away all of the things that we currently know about biological connection, gender. For that to be true, biology would have to make no difference and men and women would have to be completely the same and there would have to be no trauma associated with those kinds of family transitions or parental loss. So it would defy all of those. And I think that those questions stem from, those kinds of questions stem from the fact that we really love our gay and lesbian friends. And the gays and lesbians that I know would make incredible parents, right? But they won't, but my men friends who are gay would be incredible fathers. But they can't be mothers, right? And the lesbians that I know, I actually, know several who are parenting kids and they're good mothers. And I think that their children still struggle with father hunger. Yeah.
As I understand it, this is not just a same-sex issue or a heterosexual issue or a Christian and non-Christian.
Right.
It's a child issue.
Right.
And you said, I think early on, that you work with a very diverse population, Christians, atheists, gays, straights. But I'm assuming that to work with your organization, everybody must sign on to that one immutable truth that a child needs a mother and a father. And with working with this diverse, how do you get everybody kind of in line when you have men that wish to marry, women, and single surrogates? How do you bring all that together?
Well, actually, some of the most outspoken critics of surrogacy are gay men, because they feel like this is a human rights violation that's being promoted in their name. And so I've got one of my foreign language pages being run by an out and proud gay man who sees this as baby buying and selling, right? And understands that his own mother and father weren't optional in his life. So yeah, to be on, to be kind of on our leadership team, or you have to agree that children have a right to their mother and father. You do have to agree that marriage exists to safeguard children's rights to their mother and father, and you have to be willing to lose friends. So that's kind of what it takes to go forward with us.